Hey guys, I am every week going to send you sort of a video breakdown with some feedback on what I saw as to be the major issues that we need to address and whatever was turned in always on the week prior. I know that in the comment section of your assignments, I usually put some basic feedback for you there. You're always welcome to email me if you want me to elaborate on it. But most of the time, I will be doing that elaboration through these videos so everyone gets a chance to see it. What is the reason for that? Well, number one, because basically everything you're doing in this class are things that you will do at some point in your own classroom. So, uh, a grade is fine, but we also need to be working towards being able to effectively do that in the classroom as easily as possible. Okay, so you just submitted the literature connection last week and homework set one. And I know there are still maybe a few of those that I need to get to. A few people turned those in later in the day or had to make a resubmission because of an error with Canvas. So I'm working on getting through all that. I anticipate week two stuff to be graded by the weekend or by Monday. So by then we should be caught up just in time for you to submit week three. I'm running a little bit slower than I planned on. We had a little bit of a puppy emergency here this week, so I should be caught up by the end of the weekend. Okay, so let's talk about week one. We'll start there. In terms of the literature connection, the biggest issue I saw were in two places. First of all, with the standards, and second of all, with modifications. Okay, so I'm going to start with standards. And the reasons I'm doing that is I'm going to go up and show you exactly here where they are. Now, where the biggest manner of misunderstanding is for these standards for mathematical practice and what they are and what their purpose is and where you find them. Now, if you visit the link that I have here, which I know you have to go to an external site, it does take you to the Common Core Standards website. These are not necessarily part of the Common Core. This is not just part of the Common Core. It's something that the National Council of Mathematics Teachers has developed to be thinking about what we should be doing every single day in the classroom, no matter what content we're teaching. And if we're not doing these things, okay, in every single time we teach content, then it can be an issue for students to have really, really deep learning. So now, what are these things? These standards for mathematical practice are just these 8 that are listed here, okay? So here are the individual ones. You can click on them. But also, if you scroll down, you're going to see what they are, make sense of problems, and persevere in solving them. No matter whether you're teaching subtraction or multiplication or algebra, students should be doing this, okay? We're giving them contextual problems and we're making them think about them and make sense of them and then persevere through solving them. So if you read this description here, it gives you a little more insight into that. Reason abstractly and quantitatively, okay? So when you list standards for mathematical practice, you're going to list the MP. That stands for mathematical practice. That number is what's going to indicate which one of these things you think students are having to do in your task. Now, you shouldn't be highlighting things down here in the description. This right here is mathematical practice 2, reason abstractly and quantitatively. Okay, construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. Now, we all think that sounds like a really in-depth idea, and it is, because that's a higher level thinking. But even students at younger grades can do these through number talks and just talking about what they think their answer should be, why they come to that conclusion, and having a conversation about that with others in the class. So again, this is not dependent upon the content that you're teaching. Okay, this should be happening whether you're teaching subtraction, whether it's fractions, whether it's algebra, no matter what, this should be happening at some point in the classroom. Modeling with mathematics, that doesn't mean necessarily building something, okay? Especially if you're in the upper grades, we model through equations and data sets. So all of these things should be happening whether or not we are teaching whatever grade we're working with. So those particular 8, that should be somewhere, okay, on your literature connection. That if you see SMP with a subtraction of some points, that means I either couldn't find a practice that you wrote, or the practice that you listed did not match your activity, or you talked about the practice but did not explicitly name it. So those 8. Now, the bigger problem is that some of you then decided to go over here and click on these standards for your particular content standard. Kentucky has revised their standards. They're no longer using the Common Core Math standards. So you should not be pulling your content standards from here. If you're working in a resource classroom, or if you're working with math, this is very, very important, because you are legally responsible for making sure you are teaching the standards that your state has adopted. So it's okay to go to this page to look at the math practices. Remember, the content standards tell us what content we're teaching. The standards for math practice tell us things we should be doing in our classroom as we learn that content. Okay, so we don't want to get our content from over here. We just want to look at the standards for math practice. In terms of your content, if you are trying to look for your content standards, that comes from a separate link, which is right here. Last year, these were referred to as the revised Kentucky Academic Standards for Mathematics. They were new last year. Last year was the first year. This year, we have the second year. So when we pull these up, these should be the content standards, okay? Content standards, that's what tells you which math concept or goal your students have at a particular grade level, okay? So standards for content and standards for math practices are not the same thing. If you're still not clear, you still don't understand what the difference is, please make sure that you would come and talk to me or email me about that. Now, if you notice here in the standards document, they do list the mathematical practices up above, okay? And these are mathematical practices that could happen depending upon the activity or the teaching in your classroom while you're teaching these specific standards. Now, just because you're teaching one of these standards doesn't mean that you're using this math practice, okay? For example, if you're telling me that you're using Math Practice 5, which is appropriate tools strategically, and in your lesson, you don't have the students use any math tools, then you're not using that practice, even though you've written it down. So which one of these actually happens is dependent upon the instruction and the activities and whatnot that your class is doing. Whether this down here is dependent upon what topic you are teaching about. So I hope that makes that a little bit clearer. Okay. Now, in terms of modifications, I know this is a math class, so you're probably not expecting to get as much of this from me. And for those of you who are early on in your education in the program, this may not be something that you yet have a lot of experience with. But for the rest of you, I am a very, very strict evaluator of accommodations and modifications. Number one, because I spent 15 years in the classroom at all grade levels. So I understand what modifications and accommodations should look like. I also understand when they're used effectively and when they are not used effectively. One of the most frustrating accommodations for me to see students repeatedly use is I have assigned another student to make sure this child knows what's going on. First of all, you legally cannot do that. If someone was to evaluate your lesson plan, particularly if you are the teacher of record, and the only modification and accommodation you have written down is that you have assigned the responsibility of one student's learning to another, that is not going to go well for you. So please understand that. There's nothing wrong with collaborative learning. We know that students do learn best when they're grouped outside of their ability level, but that doesn't come from assigning one student to teach another. It comes through conversations and interactions that students have with each other to bring out that understanding. It's not because one child got assigned to teach another. please don't put that in your modifications. That's unacceptable. Secondly, I see a lot of accommodations, thankfully not so much with this assignment, where students have put, I will let them be responsible for spinning the spinner or collecting the items. Remember that accommodations and modifications are not there to excuse your student from doing the work because it's too hard for them. Accommodations and modifications are there to give your student who may have a disability a different entry point into the assignment. You can reduce the complexity of the wording and the problems. You can use different numbers, okay? For example, when I taught high school, a lot of the times, one of the modifications I would use is to have equations that only worked with whole numbers and not necessarily integers or, integers were fine, but not necessarily rational numbers like fractions and decimals. You also can be conscious about the vocabulary in which you're using. You can give modified tables or charts that have more spots filled in. There are a lot of acceptable accommodations, but assigning a student to teach another or simply excusing them from the assignment and giving them another task is not an acceptable accommodation. I would really hate for you to come into a problem later in your career because you listed that as an accommodation. Okay, so please be thoughtful about that. In terms of proper accommodations, okay, when you're thinking about that, most of the time in this class, I encourage people to think about what would you do for a student who maybe had a specific learning disability in math. I also encourage them to think about what you might do for a behavior disorder student, because that accommodation is going to look much different than what it would if you had a student who had a learning disability. So it's always nice to include, if I ask for accommodations, it's nice to include one that might address a learning disability issue, particularly in math. It might also be nice to address a behavior issue, because those are accommodations that we're all going to be required to come up with and to execute in the classroom no matter what. Okay, so if you're struggling with that, if you're having a hard time trying to figure out what are these accommodations, okay, I think I put that in your literature connection module. If you click on that assignment page and you look down at the bottom, here I have included, especially this specifically designed instruction handbook. This comes from one of the cooperatives here in Central Kentucky who works on this type of thing. And it is used by actual special education teachers in the classroom to help you come up with what modifications and what accommodations might actually be helpful for your students depending upon the disabilities that they have. For example, if they have a deficit in communication, these are some things that you can use. Now, if you continue to go on down into the academic standards or the academic discrepancies, you will see here we have basic reading, reading comprehension. And if you're working with word problems, that's still, you can pull modifications from there. Now, in math, we usually have two specific areas that we look at. We look at calculation and we look at reasoning. Okay, so what are our students need? Okay, and there are some things that we can do in order to help them. These are things you can use, accommodations that make these things more reasonable. Okay, I also want you to consider calculators. Many of you put down calculators. Now, it's not necessarily that we would never use a calculator in elementary school, but using a calculator in elementary school is something that you need to be very thoughtful about. It is usually not the go-to method, okay, to use calculators in elementary school, mostly because that's where the foundation of calculation exists. It's where you're learning that. In addition, if a student is being assessed for if we were evaluating them to see if they had a specific disability in math calculation, or if they were experiencing something like that, then they would not be allowed to use a calculator. If you're assessing calculation, you cannot give them a calculator for that. because then you're not actually getting a true evaluation of their calculation abilities. Now, if you're working with math reasoning, then in that case, if using the calculator helps the student to do that reasoning better, you can do so. One thing I suggest you read if you put down a calculator is this in the supplemental reading. There should be, maybe it's in week 2. There is a specific article about using calculators in elementary school. Okay. And there's even a flow chart. Here it is. There's even a flow chart in here that would help you to know when a calculator would be best used. Here it is. It should be in week 2. Okay, calculators for students with special needs. There it is. If you open up this article, most of the articles I post in supplemental readings are very useful for this kind of thing. They're not required, but most of my students who read them find that they have been especially helpful. So this is the flow chart I was talking about. Okay, when you're trying to make a decision about a calculator, okay, here's kind of how your thinking works. What's the purpose of this activity? If you're working with just calculation skills, you're not going to give a calculator. You might give base 10 blocks, okay? That would be a better choice. Maybe you might give counters, something along those lines, the teddy bear counters, not a calculator. However, if we're just working to solve problems, explore patterns, investigations, real-world data, and then you're going to ask yourself, can the student actually perform these needed calculations? Then a calculator might be required in order for you to do that. If they can, you can choose to give them a calculator. I would encourage you, though, to be very sparse in terms of giving students a calculator in the elementary school. That should be something that is not done unless testing has determined or you have determined through data collection that the student specifically has a calculation issue where that's going to cause a problem. Otherwise, we want them to practice calculating. The only way they're going to be able to improve that, okay, as long as there's not a true disability in terms of that calculation, is to find a manipulative or find conceptual ways to think through that. Using a calculator in first grade or second grade is something that I would strongly discourage unless there is a good, solid need for that. Okay. Now, I will also have a video that's going to come out that reviews some of the specifics about homework 1 that you should see attached to this as well.